Okay. Looks like it's working over on YouTube. We'll let some more people filter in. Welcome, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. And it looks like everything's working over on YouTube. So we can get started. Okay. All right, so welcome to episode 87. Today we're going to be talking about the 9 hallmarks of aging. And why I think this topic is both exciting and informative is because there's been a lot of progression in knowledge in terms of understanding exactly what's going on with aging. I mean, we all sort of have a general conception of what aging is in terms of, losing muscle mass and posture and wrinkles and frailty and all that sort of thing. But the scientists have done quite a bit of work to identify 9 specific factors that are associated with aging. And what makes that valuable is that when you can really define it in such a very specific way, that can ultimately lead to some therapeutics. And a lot of times when people mention things like delaying aging or reversing aging, there's often someone who comes along and argues, well, aren't we playing God, or aren't we doing something that is unnatural? And I think once you understand the biological processes that happen with aging, you really start to understand why it's actually important to do something about it. Because once you've identified the biological pathways that are involved, it makes you want to come up with solutions to those particular issues. And as a result, that will allow us to hopefully delay the onset of what is essentially the accumulation of changes, of cellular changes that lead to aging. And if you can do that, all those things that we spoke about in the very beginning in terms of, loss of muscle mass or wrinkling, decreased flexibility, general frailty, all those things will be delayed as, will be, consistently delayed. And therefore, that's going to increase our overall health span. Obviously, all of you have heard me talk about how there's a difference, obviously, between what's called lifespan and health span being the number of healthy years that you have. And that's the ultimate goal. We want to be able to hopefully extend our lives, the healthy aspect of our lives, in such a way that we can enjoy and fully appreciate, the blessing that is life. And therefore, that's the ultimate goal. And if that ultimate goal can be achieved by lifestyle changes, by selected supplements or nutraceuticals, or even perhaps the addition of certain pharmacologic agents, certain drugs, then why not? We're not playing God in that sense. What we're doing is making specific changes to certain biological processes that are harmful to your overall health, that lead to suffering. And therefore, it behooves all scientists and doctors alike that if there are things that can be done to do that, it just makes sense. And so with that, I will share my screen and we will get started. Okay, here we go. Let me blow up my screen here a little bit. And I must say that an incredible article that formed the basis of tonight's talk was written here in the journal Cell in 2013. It's called the Hallmarks of Aging by Carlos Lopez Otin. And for anyone who wants to take a deep dive into the science, this was really an incredible article that sort of summarizes things. So here we have it. We have the 9 hallmarks of aging. And they are, and by the way, you will understand what all these things mean by the end of tonight's class. So genomic instability, telomere attrition, epigenetic alteration, loss of proteostasis, deregulated nutrient sensing, mitochondrial dysfunction, cellular senescence, stem cell exhaustion, and altered intracellular communication. Now, that sounds complicated, but again, so don't hang up. You will understand all these things by the end of tonight's class, and some of them you may already know about. So what's the best definitions that we're talking about here? Well, first of all, we can think of aging as the time-dependent accumulation of cellular damage. And I like that definition. There are lots of definitions. I happen to like that particular one, that there is, from the beginning of birth to death, a certain change that goes on, a certain accumulation of things that are going on. And therefore, if we can slow down this time-dependent accumulation, that should lead to lengthening of life. And when we're talking about the hallmarks of aging, these should, according to the author that we spoke about before, ideally fulfill the following criteria. One, it should manifest during normal aging. So these things happening not just in disease processes, but in normal aging. Its experimental aggravation should accelerate aging. So that's partly how they've done these tests. They've identified what they are. And then what they've done is created a lab, whether it's in mice or whether it's in cell culture or in worms. They've been able to aggravate those particular pathways, and that has led to accelerated aging. So that's the second hallmark. And the third is its experimental amelioration should retard the normal aging process and hence increase healthy lifespan. So the same thing with the experimental thing is that if you can lessen this particular pathway or whatever it may be, then we should be able to see some sort of normal aging process and some healthy increase in healthy lifespan. So with that, let's jump right in because we have 9 of them and we're only going to have so much time to spend on each one. So let's start with probably one that you're probably already aware of, and that is that the genes just become unstable as time goes by. In other words, there's an accumulation of genetic damage. Now, we all have genes and DNA, and what we're talking about here is accumulation of DNA damage. And this is happening essentially because cells have to divide. And they're not going to necessarily do it perfectly every single time. And therefore, there are going to be, when cells divide and the DNA replicates, you have the three-dimensional, the triple helix, and that has to separate, and then you need to be able to replicate your DNA. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen perfectly each time. In addition, there's things in the cell just as normal byproducts of cell division and daily life that are called reactive oxygen species that can partially interfere. But the main thing is that it's challenged by the environment. Things like toxins, certain infections can interfere with the DNA, and of course, radiation and ultraviolet light. And therefore, it is important for you to be able to try to avoid, obviously, toxins. We've spoken about toxins several weeks ago. Optimizing your immune system to prevent infections if you can. And ultraviolet light, of course, another radiation we should try to avoid. Unfortunately, this first one, there's not a whole lot that can be done. Genomic instability is sort of one of those things that we try to control our environment as much as we can, but there's also, not a whole lot that can be done, as opposed to some of the other ones that we'll be talking about very shortly. Just in terms of ultraviolet light, there is a supplement called nicotinamide, which is a form of niacin, a form of vitamin B3, and that can actually upregulate. It can improve the ability of the cell to repair itself, the DNA to repair itself. And there have been some studies to show that for people who have a high incidence of non-melanoma skin cancers like basal cells and squamous cells and little precancers, by taking nicotinamide, which will help the DNA to repair itself, you can reduce the rate of those by 25%. So there are some things you can do, but as you'll see, unfortunately with DNA, besides controlling the environment, it's very difficult to make substantial changes. And it's important to understand that there are some cells that are going to be more important. Stem cells, which are progenitor cells, which are cells that are able to divide and turn into other cells. Obviously, because those can divide into multiple types of cells, unfortunately, if we get DNA damage in those, then it's going to be a problem for multiple cell lines. That's why that's important. And then mitochondrial DNA is another one of those things. We've spoken about the mitochondria, which is sort of the powerhouse of the cell. Unfortunately, the DNA there is also sort of not as capable of repair as some of the other DNA. And so therefore, you'll see that optimizing DNA is actually going to be important for overall aging. So let's move on to the next one. This, unfortunately, you might be thinking, oh no, not much you can do about that, but you'll see that there's lots that can be done as we go through tonight's class. Next is telomeres. Now, telomeres, basically, when the cell divides, there's an enzyme called DNA polymerase. And unfortunately, when the cell comes together, divides, replicates, and then forms another thing of DNA, unfortunately, the very ends, it's not able to replicate those. And a lot of people liken telomeres to the tips of shoelaces. And unfortunately, as you continue to have cells divide, what happens is that unfortunately, the DNA is going to get shorter, slightly shorter. These tips are going to get slightly shorter. And this was awarded, this sort of process of understanding telomeres was awarded the Nobel Prize not too long ago, actually, by a doctor by the name of Elizabeth Blackburn. And she has a very good popular book for people to read called, I think it's called The Telomere Effect, which I read several years ago, and basically details lifestyle strategies that are associated with longer telomeres. I'm just going to mute for one moment, and I'll be. Sorry about that. So this book was actually quite popular. It's still a popular book, actually, and I would recommend it. If you're interested in reading popular science books, this one by Elizabeth Blackburn is highly recommended. Some of those lifestyle strategies are eating a plant-rich diet or Mediterranean-style diet, an increase in omega-3 fatty acids, physical activity, optimizing vitamin D levels, and making sure that you have low cortisol levels, which you can do by reducing stress. So that is something that you can do something about. And of course, it's probably going to be no surprise that some of the things that we've spoken about in terms of healthy lifestyle factors, we've talked about them and the reasons behind why they're important in many different ways. And I always say that we're always trying to look at the human body from the lens of different types of things. And when you can look at certain lifestyle strategies and see the benefits, not just because of one thing, but because of multiple things, then you're able to, it's able to reinforce your resolve, I guess, and it resolves confusion. One day you see something is good for you, one day you see it's bad for you. But if you can list, or at least over time, see that there are multiple things that it's doing, then it gives you more confidence to be able to say, okay, I really get it. Now, I've learned for many different reasons why, having more plants in my specific types of plants in my diet are going to be beneficial, or why physical activity is going to be beneficial, that sort of thing. So you can do something about this. And these, of course, are associated with longer telomeres. And the longer the telomere, the better, so to speak. And actually, I just read a report that they've shown that hyperbaric chamber, just doing it like 10 or 20 minutes a week is associated with a substantial increase in longer telomeres. The question, of course, is always that if it's just doing that, what else is it doing? In the sense of, you could have a situation where just lengthening telomeres might not have any overall effect. In fact, there was some sort of medication that for quite a while, a lot of the people in, this was probably 10, I would guess like 10 years ago, I forget what it was called, but it lengthened telomeres. And it was a medicine, and people thought that that was going to be sort of some kind of remarkable anti-aging medicine. And the titans of Silicon Valley were all taking it, and I don't know what happened, but it's not popular anymore. So obviously, it didn't turn out to be the blockbuster that everyone thought. And so therefore, you always want to be cautious when they start isolating things to, making it so specific, because you never really know, if it's just lengthening the telomere in some unusual way, that could have an effect somewhere else. And so therefore, if we are doing omega-3 fatty acids and physical activity and plant-rich diet, all those things you've certainly learned over and over again why those are important. Okay, so let's move next to epigenetic alterations. So epigenetics basically mean that that this is happening outside of the genes. One definition that I came across is a change in the chemical structure of DNA that does not change the DNA coding sequence. So epigenetic alterations occur in the body when chemical groups are added or removed, and when changes are made to proteins. So in other words, the way you can think about this is things that are affecting the DNA, but not affecting the actual chemical structure of DNA, not changing the actual sequence. And when the Human Genome Project was finished, everyone thought that they would have the answer to so many different things because they've just sequenced the entire genome. But what we've actually found is that there are so many things going on around the DNA, outside of the DNA, that are having a substantial effect on the DNA. And that's what's termed epigenetic alteration. So there is all kinds of things going on. And therefore, that's why the Human Genome Project didn't yield as many amazing results as people thought it was going to, because of the fact that the genes, the way they express themselves, is really influenced by a whole host of things going on outside the DNA. And there was, I can't pronounce this person's name, but came up with the notion of an epigenetics diet and came across things that modified in a beneficial way these external factors to the DNA. And the ones that he showed were green tea, being very, very potent, sulforaphane, which is found in cruciferous vegetables, curcumin, which is found in turmeric, resveratrol, which is found in grapes and wine, genistein, which is found in soybeans, and calorie restriction, some form of fasting. And you're going to see some of these things repeat as we go through tonight's class, because there are things that are going on that are affecting multiple pathways that we're talking about tonight. I must mention, by the way, that with resveratrol, which was very popular, 10, 15 years ago, because of its anti-aging, what it does to anti-aging pathways, you obviously have to drink like you don't get a whole lot in wine. You don't get, but I've actually been adding grapeseed powder and grape skin powder to my smoothies. I found a company that, but anyway, you could take it as a supplement, but it's always nice to be able to get these things from natural sources if you can. I've certainly often said, and repeating the advice of other doctors as well, which is that, you should be eating a substantial amount of vegetable leafy greens per day, and half of them should be cruciferous vegetables for a whole host of reasons, this being one of them. And I also might add that, when it comes to the pathways for cancer, they're not all that different from what we're talking about tonight. So that's another reason why cruciferous vegetables also have an incredible anti-cancer effect as well. Okay, so we'll move on. So now we've covered the first three. And we understand the issue of DNA instability as time goes by, and how there's not a whole lot you can do, but you can try to make sure you're not being exposed to any sort of toxins or radiation. Then there's the telomeres that are shortening, and we spoke a little bit about why that's happening and what you can do from a lifestyle perspective. Those sorts of behaviors and diet that are associated with longer telomeres. And now we've talked about what's going on around the DNA to what can we do to affect favorable DNA expression from the outside. And we spoke about these sort of lifestyle things. So now let's go to the next one, which is loss of proteostasis or protein homeostasis. That sounds weird, right? But what you'll understand this with one picture. So here we have, this is what a protein looks like in the human body. Of course, I don't know, I just grabbed this off the internet, but this is an example of a protein. And we have all these proteins. We have all kinds of things that are elaborately constructed in so many ways that, there are bonds, connections between all these things to make sure that this folds in the right way. And unfortunately, if it's misfolded, like for example, if this particular stringy thing here is not exactly in that location and is pointing downward, it could render an enzyme completely ineffective or less effective, or maybe doing the wrong thing. And unfortunately, as time goes by and we age, this amazingly complex structure, which has all the different proteins in our body, have different shapes and folding and all this sort of thing. What happens over time is we just lose the efficacy. We're not as good at folding and creating these elaborate protein structures. And remember, if they're not constructed perfectly, they're going to lose their efficacy or be not effective at all. And that is another contributing factor to aging. So what can we do to restore proteostasis? In other words, what can we do to ensure that these proteins are folding in this complicated way, in the proper way? One way is to exercise, believe it or not. Your exercise, it's almost like you're optimizing your body in whatever way, and it allows the body to be able to fold these proteins and create these complicated structures more efficiently. Shivering, believe it or not, and heat like sauna activates certain proteins that can help with protein folding and help the protein to fold in a proper way. Therefore, you'll see a lot of, quote, body hackers and billionaires who are installing in their houses these cold pools where they dip in 45-degree cold water, and they get a little bit of shiver going. This is part of the reason. There are other benefits to that, but one of the benefits is that it allows the body to be more efficient and effective at creating the folding of these proteins. Also, autophagy. Now, we've spoken about autophagy before. If you weren't on those particular classes, autophagy is the body being able to remove, old parts of cells and even old cells themselves, and proteins as well. So autophagy is often activated during fasting, a certain amount of fasting, when the body starts to digest itself. Remarkably, it's able to digest the parts of the body that are not effective or old, that need to be repaired. The body knows it's effective at identifying those particular parts of the body that are just not working all that well. And so when you're doing some sort of fasting, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, your body is remarkably capable of identifying old parts of cells, old proteins, old cells themselves, and digest them, remove them. And therefore, that's another way of restoring this. But also, it's most likely that in the future, there probably will be pharmaceuticals that will allow us to be able to restore proteostasis. And so certainly, if you can restore the ability to create these incredibly elaborate structures, I mean, to me, it's just amazing when you see the complexity of proteins. Incidentally, when you're eating an egg, when you have an egg white, which is like a form of, it's albumin. And albumin is not as complicated as a structure as this. But when you heat the albumin and it turns into an egg white, what's happening is all these bonds are sort of being destroyed. And this is all just sort of collapsing into this mess of amino acids. And that's actually what's happening when you cook an egg white. This sort of 3D elaborate structure with all these sort of magnetic and chemical bonds that are here sort of collapse into an egg white. That's sort of what happens when protein, quote, denatures. Just something that popped into my mind. All right, so let's move on to the next one. So we've covered 4 of them. We have a good idea of genes, of the DNA and that instability. We now understand the ends of those shoelace caps and trying to keep them long. And then we understand how DNA is expressed by things not just internal to the DNA, but outside of the DNA. And now we're understanding this fact that your body needs to continually make proteins. This is part of life. And one of the hallmarks of aging is this lack of being able to fold and create those elaborate structures. Next is what's called deregulated nutrient sensing. And we've spoken about this quite a bit over the months. And there's probably not an episode that goes by where I don't mention insulin and IGF-1 signaling. And there are so many reasons for that, but we have to look back at the words here, nutrient sensing. This is your body responding to various foods and creating a response. It's like, as some people say, information, a food is information. And in this sense, certain foods are sending information to activate certain pathways in the body. And if insulin, which is activated obviously by things with high blood sugar, and IGF-1, which is also activated by animal protein, as well as some other things, but they often run hand in hand. If those are out of whack, unfortunately, that's going to lead to unfortunately advanced aging, not the least of which is associated with increased blood sugar. And insulin in and of itself is a growth factor, which can also lead to this deregulated growth, which is like cancer, is deregulated growth. So keeping your insulin level low, reasonably low, and your IGF-1 in sort of a comfortable area is going to be important. Of course, we've spoken about that before, and that is making sure anything that's going to spike your blood sugar potentially is going to raise your insulin level. But what the focus of a lot of things that's going on are what are called mTOR, AMPK, and sirtuins. Now, mTOR, which stands for mammalian target of rapamycin, is a protein sensor. And what we found is when mTOR is really too activated, overactivated, unfortunately, that's going to lead to things that are going in the body that would likely lead to a shorter lifespan. Now, it's not protein in general. It's actually one amino acid called leucine that is mostly activating mTOR. And you don't want mTOR to be completely low. You want you want it on the low side, but not too low. All these things, when it comes to nutrient sensing, is finding sort of a comfortable thing, comfortable, not middle, but in terms of mTOR on the low side. The issue, however, is that mTOR is also associated with muscle growth. And one of the factors of aging is loss of muscle. So how do we maintain a good amount of muscle mass, but not have too high of a level of mTOR? Well, a lot of people have have thought about this, and the issue can be resolved simply by being careful with the amount of leucine that you eat and timing the leucine. In other words, the perfect time, we've already established in multiple episodes that people eat way too much animal protein. But leucine, which is found, is found at a very high level in things like chicken, beef, and fish, and pork, and animal proteins. If you eat them, you can time the eating. In other words, let's say you go to the gym, and you go to the gym because you want to maintain your muscle mass or gain muscle. So how do we maintain a low level of mTOR? How do we keep that low, but still get a boost of mTOR at certain periods of time to be able to maintain our muscle mass? And the answer is after you're lifting your weights or doing your resistance work, which probably should be done, in a fasting state, then that meal immediately after working out, you can have, a whey protein shake, which is going to have leucine in it. And that's going to help you to be able to increase mTOR for the period of time after working out, when your muscles can, the mTOR can go up and your muscles can use the energy to grow or to maintain your muscle mass. But if you're chronically eating animal protein throughout the day with tons and tons of leucine, that unfortunately is going to lead to chronically elevated levels of mTOR, which are ultimately not going to be beneficial. So we want to be very, very selective with when we activate mTOR. And that's basically how most people these days are doing it, which is, again, working out on a fasted state and having a higher protein meal or shake with leucine in it after working out, but not continuing to eat that way for the rest of the day. Okay. Incidentally, there is leucine in plants, but not nearly as much. There is a decent amount in soy protein. I'm not a big fan of having high concentrations of soy protein, but for people, especially people who are, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, having a whey protein shake would be beneficial, could be beneficial after working out or after doing resistance work, for sure, especially if you're not eating that much animal protein. Next is AMPK, which is otherwise known as sort of the master switch of the cell. And while we want high levels of mTOR, lower levels of mTOR, anything we can do to boost AMPK is going to shift us in the right direction in terms of longevity. And this is activated by fasting, gynostemma, which is tea that I like to drink, berberine, metformin, which is diabetes medicine, also activates AMPK. And then there's sirtuins, which are also sort of go hand in hand with AMPK in a lot of ways. And these can be activated again by resveratrol, NAD, which has become a very popular supplement amongst anti-aging enthusiasts and body hackers, and fasting and cold, like we mentioned before. So you're starting to see that there are some things that are starting to overlap when it comes to multiple pathways of aging. Okay, so now we have covered, the DNA itself. We've talked about what's going on outside the DNA, helping to optimize that. We've talked about the tips of the DNA. We've talked about protein, and we've now sort of jumped into the metabolism of your body in the sense of what's going on. How are you activating insulin? Are you activating mTOR? Are you activating AMPK? All those things are going to have either negative or beneficial effects when it comes to aging. So next is the mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. That's what always people say. And because they're the powerhouse of the cell, you can think of them as, the plant, the power plant of the cell. And the power plant of the cell, unfortunately, is going, just like a power plant in the real world, is going to release smoke. And in this case, we call that reactive oxygen species, these sort of toxic byproducts. But when it comes to reactive oxygen species, it used to be thought that this was like the end all be all of aging. And that's why in the 80s, everyone wanted to take antioxidants. And they felt that if we could just put out the fire of these reactive oxygen species, that aging would go away. But what we've actually found is that you need it for a certain period of time. And as the paper said, in quote, as chronological age advances, the level of reactive oxygen species increase in an attempt to maintain survival until they betray their original purpose and eventually aggregate rather than alleviate the age-associated damage. So what was thought of before as always negative, we're finding out isn't really negative until a certain point, and then it starts to be associated with damage. So here we have the mitochondria, which again are the powerhouse of the cells, and what we want to do is restore the function to the dysfunction. One of the ways of doing that, and because again these are the powerhouse of the cell, it makes sense that doing exercise, endurance training, is going to get those cells moving even more than they were at rest. And so therefore, endurance training, exercise, is really going to be helpful. There's also the concept of mitohormesis. And mitohormesis, we've spoken about hormesis in another class, which could be really thought of as a beneficial stressor. And it's actually thought that things like metformin and even resveratrol, which we mentioned a few times now, are probably mild toxins to the mitochondria. And now mild, meaning that the mitochondria responds by getting stronger. And this is one way of restoring function. Of course, fasting can also help as well. I didn't include that, but fasting is another technique that can be used. And when I say fasting, there are many kinds of fasting. And my favorite type of fasting is called biological fasting, which is otherwise known as a fasting mimicking diet, which is a 5-day reduced calorie vegan diet that you can do, and that I've given talks on before that you can see on the YouTube channel, the history of the YouTube channel. All right. So we've covered now genes, both from internal side of the genes to outside the genes to the tips of the genes, to protein, to all those metabolic signals that activate insulin and protein. Now we're deep into the cell with the powerhouse of the cell. Now we're going to move to what's called cellular senescence. And cellular senescence is what's otherwise known as zombie cells. These are cells that are basically in a stage where they're still alive, they're not dividing, and they're not dividing partly because it's a protective mechanism, that if they started to divide, they're sort of so damaged that they may turn cancerous. So there is sort of a beneficial effect, but unfortunately, with time, they don't just sit there. They release pro-inflammatory markers. In other words, here are these cells. They're basically, they haven't died. They are alive. They're releasing pro-inflammatory. They're increasing the inflammation in your body. And worst of all, just like a zombie can convert another zombie into another person into a zombie, these zombie cells can also create other zombie cells through what's called contagious aging. So you have one zombie cell, it can unfortunately create another zombie cell. So it sounds crazy, but unfortunately what's triggering this is telomere shortening as one thing. So you're seeing how these hallmarks are starting to interact. Poor immune functioning. So we always have to be conscious of our immune function. And I have a class on optimizing your immune function, so you can go back and listen to that if you have time. there are some genetic markers, and there's this lack of regenerative capacity that's happening. And so we want to get rid of these cells as best as we can. And you start getting them at a relatively early age. But as you get older, again, we're talking about the accumulation of damage. You're going to get more and more of these as time goes by. Autophagy is going to be, remember I said the body knows when it goes into an autophagy, which again, the most effective way of doing that is through some sort of fasting. And it could be even intermittent fasting. You get a little bit of autophagy. That's a potential way of getting rid of these zombie cells. Tocotrienols, which is a type it's in the vitamin E family. And now there are companies like the Life Extension Foundation that has what are called senolytic activator combinations. And one of them has fisetin, quercetin, theoflavins from tea, apigenin, I think, is from celery. All these combined, you take them, no one's really sure what the optimal way of taking these anti-senolytic cell compounds are. Life Extension Foundation, with this particular senolytic activator that I happen to take myself and have my mother taking it as well, is meant to be taken once a week. But ultimately, ultimately more work needs to be figured out. It needs to be figured out exactly what the ideal ratio is for that sort of thing. So stay tuned for that. But it's great that that these are available. Fisetin has been around for a while, but it's not absorbed well. And Life Extension Foundation came up with a way of making it very highly bioavailable, and that is what I consider to be a pretty significant advance. And then the combination of all these, I think it's a good product. Anyway, moving along. Okay, now we have a few more left. I'm just checking my time. The next one is stem cell exhaustion. Now, as I said, stem cells are the cells that have the capacity of turning into multiple cells. Like, for example, stem cells in your bone marrow can turn into all the different components of what make up your blood. And so what's happening, unfortunately, is stem cell exhaustion. And the cause of this, telomere shortening. So again, we're seeing that coming into effect here. And so again, if you're flying anywhere for the holidays and you have a Kindle or you want to grab Elizabeth Blackburn's book, it's a very fun read. We can talk more about the science and lifestyle suggestions she makes to optimize telomere length. Epigenetic alterations also. So we're getting now deeper down into these causes. You're starting to see the multiple things affecting things. So remember, we spoke about epigenetic alteration here. Remember, that was what's happening outside the genes that are influencing the genes. And then we spoke about the epigenetic diet, green tea, cruciferous vegetables, curcumin, resveratrol, etc. So what can you do? What can you do about this stem cell exhaustion? Well, you can suppress mTOR. And remember, we just spoke about that, which is that the animal protein that has more leucine in it. So we want to be very selective about the animal protein that we eat. If we can time it around exercise, that is even better. Or we can just make sure that we're not eating too much of animal protein. Fasting, again, specifically biological fasting, because the original studies that I've mentioned many times that were done by Dr. Walter Longo, who created the fasting mimicking diet, this 5-day reduced calorie diet that has all the benefits of fasting without actually having to fast. They have shown that there is an increase in stem cells. Stem cell therapy, there are anti-aging clinics that are doing stem cell therapy. I think it's too soon. I'm not the only one to think that. I think it's too soon to be able to do that, quite frankly. And obviously, we've spoken about two of the causes, telomere shortening and epigenetic alteration. So focus on the lifestyle interventions and diet that we spoke about with telomere shortening and epigenetic alteration. So to review the telomere shortening, just because we have it up here, is Mediterranean diet, omega-3 fatty acids, physical activity, optimizing vitamin D levels, getting rid of your stress, eating lots of leafy greens. Okay. And finally, altered intracellular communication. And this is basically the ability of your cells to communicate. That's unfortunately, as you age, in addition to these stem cells getting exhausted, the cells, are not communicating the way that they should. And the main reason for that is inflammation. And the inflammation is basically interfering with communication. So there's tissue damage from inflammation, there's lack of clearance of pathogens, toxins, senescent cells. All these things are happening, unfortunately. And as we've spoken about, those zombie cells, those senescent cells, they're not just sitting there, they're releasing these inflammatory cytokines that are causing even more inflammation. So I gave a talk specifically on inflammation, probably 15, 20 weeks ago. I'll include a link to that in the notes below on the YouTube page when I get around to it. But the key for this one is basically this slow smoldering. It's called inflammaging, where as you get older, unfortunately, it's associated with this low-grade inflammation that's having potentially profound negative effect on your body. So what to do? Well, they've found certain factors in blood, or at least they're trying to find these factors. Parabiosis it's sort of mocked by a lot of people because they took the young blood of young individuals and gave it to elderly people. And of course that led to articles about how, older billionaires are acting like vampires because they want the blood of young people. But ultimately, that's not going to be necessary. There are people who do this, by the way. It does sound unusual. But the key ultimately is to identify the factors that are associated with this decrease in inflammation that are found in young people's blood. And they're working on that. Dietary restrictions and fasting are also helpful. Addressing inflammation and microbiome maximization. In other words, the microbiome is capable of reducing the inflammation in your body in a pretty substantial way. There are certain species of bacteria that can help with inflammation, but ultimately, if you have a very well diversified microbiome, which you get from eating a wide variety of different plants, that's how you get a healthy microbiome. That is going to ultimately lead to a decrease in inflammation. And that's why I always recommend that when people are eating plants, we often get into the habit of eating the same vegetables over and over again. And what we want to do, if you look at the populations that have this incredible microbial diversity, they eat an enormous number of species. I don't remember the amount, but we don't do that. We're eating the same sort of things, same types of vegetables over and over again. So we live in an incredible time where you can go to the store and there are so many different kinds of plants and leafy greens too. And you should, be sprinkling these different vegetables into your diet, trying new vegetables all the time so that you can, especially those with fiber, so that you can give your microbiome the most diverse food that will allow them to diversify, and that will ultimately lead to decreased inflammation and overall increased health, not just in terms of inflammation, but in terms of, believe it or not, your skin, your mood. All your microbiome is interacting with just about every part of your body, we're finding out. And so the thing you can do best is to make sure that you have the most diversified microbiome. And again, you do that by eating a wide variety of plants. Okay, so we have covered all 9. And just to review, close this down. So to review, ultimately what I find really fascinating about this whole thing is how exciting it actually is, because we're going to be able to get to a point, and we already are, where there are going to be very specific things that we can do to improve these sort of 9 hallmarks of aging. So we started out tonight's talk talking about how really, when we're talking about aging, we're talking about the accumulation of damage to cells. And this damage to cells is happening on a genetic level through the instability of the DNA, through the tips of the DNA, and the inability of the body to replicate those, and this longer it's going to be associated with unfortunate problems with aging. Then we led into these epigenetic changes, which are, again, what's happening outside of the DNA that's influencing the expression of the DNA. We went through some lifestyle changes there. And then we spoke about how proteins are so sensitive. I mean, the picture just really says it all, that your body, unfortunately, is going to have some difficulty, or it's not going to be as efficient as you get older. And therefore, there are some things that you can do to shock the system back into place, whether that's through fasting, exercise, or cold and shivering, that can upregulate certain proteins that help the folding of these complex proteins. Then we went into nutrient sensing associated with high blood sugar or high protein and the consequences of those things. And then the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, we spoke about. Then we moved to the zombie cells, and we spoke a little bit about how they have a reason for being, but unfortunately with time, they're going to have a certain, negative aspect. And the exciting fact is that there are certain supplements that have shown to have some effect on cellular senescence. And then we went into stem cell exhaustion, and how that also is affected with, you can improve things through mTOR and biological fasting, as well as all the things associated with some of those other things we spoke about. And finally, we spoke about inflammation and its effect on influencing, in a negative way, the ability of cells to communicate. And of course, we've spoken about that quite a bit over time, how to address inflammation in the body. So we've covered all 9. And initially, when I was thinking about this, I thought about doing one a week, but I realized that it would be honestly, it would just be too complicated to do an hour on, say, well, probably you could easily do an hour on telomere attrition based on Elizabeth Blackburn's book. The others, it would be a little bit difficult to do. So I hope you found that interesting. And ultimately, my goal for doing this particular talk is so that you can see, one, certain repeated activities and dietary suggestions that are coming across over and over again, and seeing how they can influence aging in addition to a whole host of other things we've spoken about. 2, the other goal I had for tonight was that you would see that working on reducing aging is not an unnatural thing. It is a natural thing. These sorts of things, if left, can lead to suffering and can lead to premature aging. And so we want to live as healthy as we possibly can. And by identifying these, we certainly gives us a little more insight into what we can do. And then finally, I find the whole topic, it's going to be repeated again and again. And, I'm looking at sort of the list of people on tonight's class, and, a lot of you have been with me for quite a long time. And so some of what we spoke about tonight will allow you to understand in a deeper way some of the things that we'll be discussing, in the coming weeks. So hope that was enjoyable. I am going to have a class next week as well. We're going to be talking about natural solutions to pain. We all know that there's a terrible opioid epidemic in the United States. And also in that talk, I basically want to discuss natural solutions to alleviating pain. Also talk about some of the negative consequences of Tylenol and NSAIDs like Advil, and how to, if you need to take those, how to reduce the risk that those medicines potentially play, especially Tylenol or acetaminophen can have really profound negative effects on your body. And there are solutions to that, to the negative things, as well as some natural solutions for the pain. So I look forward to seeing you all next week, Wednesday Night Live at 8 p.m. And for all of you celebrating Christmas, I hope you're doing it with your family and that you have a loving and Merry Christmas. So I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.